In Jess Walter's latest novel, The Cold Millions, the industrial workers of the world, known popularly as the Wobblies, united to fight the repression of laborers and break the system of corruption and kickbacks that fleece them and all their efforts for better working conditions and fair pay. Elizabeth Gurley Flynn, a 19-year-old orator of the movement known as the Rebel Girl, and a small cast of other historical figures take center stage in this fictionalized account set in Spokane, Washington in 1909, where two brothers are swept up by the violence and drama of that time. This is Book Public from Texas Public Radio. I'm Yvette Benavides. Brothers Rye and Gig Dolan make up part of the large underclass settled in the Spokane, Washington area at the turn of the century. They are young and idealistic and searching for honest work, but they're soon caught up in the ills that befall the efforts of the IWW to fight for workers' rights. It's not so much that they believe in and understand the philosophies of the movement, but they are idealistic and driven by their own sense of a muddled morality that drives them further into the snarl of both the labor leaders of those battles and the exploitive employment agencies and other nefarious types, as well as the cast of suffragettes, vaudevillians, and an array of unforgettable characters. I spoke to Jess Walter about his latest novel, The Cold Millions. So can you just tell us a little bit about The Cold Millions and just set things up for our listeners who maybe haven't read the book yet?
Sure. The Cold Millions is a historical novel about the free speech riots of 1909. It follows two brothers, Gig and Rye Dolan, who are itinerant workers, hobos, who get drawn into the free speech riots and the battle for economic justice led by Elizabeth Gurley Flynn, a real-life character and union organizer who was involved in the early industrial workers of the world and their battles against local law enforcement, police brutality, and a lot of issues that I think resonate in the world today.
And you mentioned Elizabeth Gurley Flynn. She's at the heart of this known as the Rebel Girl. How did this person and her work even become the seedbed for this novel?
It's interesting. For years, I have looked for a way to write about income inequality, which I find to be, something that as a culture, we don't spend enough time talking about how insidious and disastrous it's been for this country. And I had known about this period in my hometown in the early 1900s and the battle that the industrial workers of the world put up for free speech and for workers' rights. And knowing that there was this real life historical figure, Elizabeth Gurley Flynn, who came west as a teenager and arrived in Spokane pregnant, 19 years old, estranged from her husband, and 10 years before women had the right to vote, led this peaceful protest that in many ways changed the history of the West and of labor in America. I just thought, how has this character slipped through the cracks of history? And a historical novel felt like a way for me to restore that character to a place that I think she deserves in the culture.
I mean, that is just such rich and fertile ground for research. The industrial workers of the world, the free speech rights, the labor movements of that era of the early 1900s. But then I think about how fertile that ground is for the imagination and for you to simply ping from those facts and those people to create this other imagined world with imagined people. It makes so much sense. It's not just like this one dimensional space of hobos and nobody cares and it's not interesting. It's such a rich landscape, and these characters are just endlessly fascinating.
Yeah, thank you. I think that was my goal. I wanted to write something big and rip-roaring. I wanted to write an end of the West period feeling sort of novel. And And if I could append that fictional story to something that I felt like deserved more attention, I felt like I could hopefully accomplish those two things, write a novel that you get lost in, the way you might get lost in Lonesome Dove or in True Grit, or something else of that sort of historical period, or Deadwood, but also hopefully with those issues that they were dealing with at that time, with very real implications of the protests that they were engaged in, that I could draw a direct line to what we in the United States have dealt with the last few years, from the Black Lives Matter protests of last summer to protests by young people over climate change, walking out of schools for climate change, or reasonable gun laws. I think in finding these young characters, my protagonists, Gig and Rye, are 16 and 23 when the novel starts. And of course, Elizabeth Gurley Flynn was 19 when she led this movement. In that way, I could write in some way about the idealism of young people always, and the way they are so driven politically. And so, yeah, I felt like it was the opportunity to do two things, and with the power and hopefully the sweep of the narrative to to draw that line to the place we're at in the country now.
So Gig and Rye, when you start out reading this book, perhaps because he's such a presence and ostensibly the leader in this partnership, right? These two brothers.
Okay.
It feels like Gig will sort of carry the whole story. And of course, he's so important. But it was so interesting to see how Rye absorbs that role and how he emerges as a protagonist, and with such far-reaching connections in the story. That's something I really appreciated about the way that he just grows and develops as a character. And there's always sort of like this aside about, well, he's really young, but he's just experiencing just a mountain of problems. And I imagine that must be the story of so many young people from that era.
Yeah, in some ways, I think, someone of that age in that time grew up faster. The place Gig and Rye come from, these mining towns in Montana, if they had stayed and worked in the mine, their average life expectancy would be their late 30s anyway. That's the life Elizabeth Gurley Flynn was headed toward if she returned, to her husband, who was a miner in Butte, Montana. So it's a shorter life. You learn things faster. But I so appreciate that you saw Rye that way, because I think for me too, I knew going in I was writing a social novel. I knew going in there would be great adventure in the period and the place and these wild, larger than life characters. I think one of the things that surprised me as a writer was that it was a coming of age story. It was really Rye growing into these beliefs, into the person that he became. And I loved for both he and Gig that the vehicle of their growth was a book, was War and Peace by Tolstoy. And the way Gig almost hands that off to his brother, it's almost like a baton in a relay race. And as someone who is a working class kid who feels like everything that he gained in the world came from books, it was really lovely to be able to hand that to my characters.
Well, I have to say that every single scene that involved books absolutely broke me, from the line about Gig always carried a book in his bindle, and he treasured the incomplete works of Tolstoy, right? Because he just had 3 of the volumes from the 5-volume set. And somehow more heartbreaking was what's almost like this Corsican connection that Rye ends up having with books. The way he himself takes on this same affinity because he wanted to get to know his brother better, but then he just owns that passion for books. And so the line, he always carried a book in his bindle and read as if he expected an exam, that just punched me in the gut. And Rye was moved to tears to see the walls of books in Lem's mansion, knowing that his brother probably won't ever be able to experience anything like that in his life. And then the library. It's just the appearance of books in the novel was so, I mean, it was so natural and organic and perfect, but it was just such an emotional element of the novel that I don't know that I had expected.
Yeah, thank you so much. I don't know if it's against the writers union to admit that you sometimes cause yourself to tear up, but every time that those scenes you're talking about, I felt that the same way. I felt that so personally, as a kid who grew up believing in a sort of egalitarian nature of this country, that education and books were the social escalator. It was the way that you dreamed that everyone could sort of be equal. And so, yeah, the title of the book comes from a moment when Rye is sitting in the library of a wealthy mining magnate, and ostensibly the villain of the book, Lemuel Brand, and he's surrounded by a floor-to-ceiling library of leather-bound, gilded-edged books that this millionaire will never even crack, that they're only there for show. And in that moment, he comes to realize that it's not 5 or 6 or 10 levels separating him from this kind of wealth, but an infinite number, that this person has so much money. And it does break his heart for just a moment, because he knows his brother couldn't even dream of a room like this, with heated floors and brandy in his belly and books, a lifetime of books. And for Gig, who has come across War and Peace on the Great Hobo Highway, trading books with other hobos, other well-read, learned hobos. Yeah, it's really an emotional moment, and I that connects, as you said later, with a scene in a Carnegie library where a librarian really treats Rye decently for the first time in the novel, the first sort of civilian, by giving him the later versions of War and Peace. So I do feel like the novel's heart is in a library, and as probably mine is. I think sometimes when you're writing fiction, there are certain things about yourself you can't escape, and my romanticism is always sparked when somebody's handed a great book.
I appreciated that, and the librarian very much. The other thing that Rye really appreciates is clothes. And he asks Fred, the lawyer, for a bowler hat. And then the way he's willing to pay for expensive gloves and what that means to him. And then the suit he invests in. But also, speaking of folks in the novel, like the librarian, who extend a certain level of compassion to Rye. I'm thinking now about Chester from the clothing store, who helps him buy his suit. He helps him shop around for one. I keep thinking now about the characters here, even Willard, of all characters, helping Rye tie his tie in the automobile. I think I read that part through tears. I think book reviewers also have to come clean when that happens. These are very complicated people. They are certainly not all good, but they're also not all bad. And I really appreciated seeing them, those individuals, in those moments where they see this kid who's obviously has had a rough go of things, and they extend that compassion. That's not far-fetched. That's not, I just thought the wheels of this story keep turning because of that, because of those actions and that level of compassion that the characters give to each other in these moments, small moments.
Yeah, and I think those wheels are humanity. They're that common thing that we somehow find ourselves looking past. But for a character like Rye, who's orphaned, who's lost all of his family except this one brother, and is following his older brother around, working itinerant jobs. But he is a clothes horse. It's one of the great thrills of fiction writing, is when you start to realize things about your characters, and it causes us novelists sometimes to resort to a kind of mysticism, that the characters act on their own or something, and they really don't. But you find yourself learning about them as you go along, and that quality is so thrilling. And it did give Rye moments to imagine himself on the other side of this great class divide. He will stand and watch people on the streetcar and imagine their lives, imagine where they're going, and that growth, that ability to imagine himself there. It was interesting for me writing a novel in which the protagonist was not necessarily the hero. If you know what I mean. The hero of the novel is very much Elizabeth Gurley Flynn. Rye, as the protagonist, is almost representative of what can be achieved through the goals that Elizabeth Gurley Flynn has. And so his aspiration to rise up into the dawning middle class of America in the 20th century is only possible because of the heroism that he encounters in the labor movement.
And I mean, this is a coming of age. He is coming into his own and figuring out what he likes. And one of those things happens to be clothes. And we learn as readers the names of so many styles and cuts of collars and suits, and unrelated to clothing, but related to something else. I also now know what a plate rail is. Uh,
Yeah.
and there are so many other really specific terms we learn, and also sort of the vernacular of the time. Dalvo's grog blossom nose, and some of these other terms I didn't have to Google because of all of the context clues. But how did you come to the lexicon of that time?
So an author loves to hear that the context and that the sort of the almost the soup of the novel carries all the flavor it needs. That you
Yeah.
can that a character like Dell can say, "Spokane gave me the morbs," and and you don't have to go look up the word morbs to find out that it was a 19th century word, to describe a feeling of unease. That you can sort of get that from the character,
Yeah.
and that was one of the great thrills of this book, was immersing myself in that language, in the last bits of 19th century Victorian language, in slang that has been lost, in the language of the workers of that time. That gig would get a job, get one end of a two-man misery whip, a saw that you would, a big saw that it took two men to operate, or that Rye would pound wedges in the kerfs, to keep the saws from binding. That, that language was so rich for me that it was in many ways like a melody that I just really wanted to play. I wanted to live in that world, and in Del Dalvo's world of morbs, and being lob-cocked, and being banty fanged, and all of that. Yeah, it was a rich language that I felt like I had to become fluent in, so then I could write the novel, and hopefully readers would gain a sort of fluency themselves, because I think it's a rich vernacular that was especially, for me, was especially potent in this world. The danger of the world, the economic differences, all those things I just felt like were, that they came together in that language.
There's this line in the novel that's repeated: "A woman owns nothing in this world but her memories." The women in the novel, they are another driving force, and I've considered the ways that they are critical. Obviously, Elizabeth Gurley Flynn, of course, but also in ways different and similar, Ursula the Great. And I was thinking earlier about even Mrs. Ritchie. I thought, imagine how important, again, her compassion, but also their industriousness, their ingenuity, and their industriousness. I just was so impressed with seeing these characters just also dealing with the problems of that time in their own individual ways, just to survive.
Yeah, it's really interesting to write female characters and give them agency at a time when almost by law they were not afforded agency.
Yeah.
And you have Elizabeth Gurley Flynn, who is really irrepressible, a force of nature. You know, you have this 19-year-old just, you know, standing on street corners demanding rights for workers and free speech and and women's rights. And if you're not careful, you can sort of imagine that that's how everyone could act. And she's singular, you know, that historical figure was, you know, her audacity. I think you also need to see people who manage that world in different ways. Ursula the Great manages it through her own charm and talent, and through the desire of some of these men around her. Mrs. Ricci, the boarding house who runs the boarding house, you know, manages it through the kindness to these young men, and her own maybe disappointment in her real sons. And then Gemma, who is another female character in the book, and you know, and has to hide her ethnicity, hide the fact that that you know her mother is Roma and is what would have been called Gypsy at the time, and that her father is Native American. And so all those characters are managing the same world that Elizabeth Gurley Flynn is, but they're managing it in ways in which they have to work within the system, a very, you know, an unfair, misogynistic system in which they're 10 years from having the right to even vote, to own property, you know, a second-class citizenship that women lived under. And so creating those characters and giving them a fullness, hopefully was a way to not only illustrate their characters, but to show, I think, how singular someone like Gurley Flynn was.
I had a research project with a co author on the city of San Antonio. And when all you have to figure out about the history of a place is newspapers, or mostly newspapers, microfilm and microfiche, you do have to sort of cross-reference and research and triangulate and double-check and make sure that you've got your facts straight. In the papers of this city of San Antonio, of certain eras, it seemed like one or another newspaper was in fact perpetuating a kind of a line of soft bigotry or bigotry.
Sure.
And also there were things we were sort of suspicious about, some of the stories that we couldn't cross corroborate. Did you encounter that when you were researching for this novel? Anything like that?
Oh, definitely. And a great deal of my research was newspapers. There were 4 daily newspapers in Spokane, 3 sometimes during this period, and 2 of them were establishment newspapers. They were, you know, they were very much the voice of establishment Spokane, of the police and the city council. And then there were 2. There was a labor newspaper, and then there was a sort of populist newspaper, Hearst newspaper. And you used the word triangulate, which is exactly what I felt like I was doing. I would read about the same event in all 4 different newspapers, and they might as well have been describing not just different events, but different universes. It's interesting. We take for granted now that you'll get a different version of reality if you watch Fox News, or if you watch MSNBC, if you listen to NPR, or if you listen to Rush Limbaugh. But that world's not new. It was another of those echoes that I felt, another of those resonances that I think there's a certain freedom in writing fiction. As I said, you're almost aiming more for a fluency in the time than you are the exact details of what happened. And that fluency allowed me to then create characters who can experience the world based on the best estimates that I can make after reading those various newspapers. The way the free speech protests in Spokane were covered by those 4 different newspapers, and also by the accounts of protesters who survived, was miles apart. And so within that, you do have to sort of navigate a best guess about what could have happened. I think, the motives of various, sides are, allow you to maybe lean more toward one or another. Seeing the account of someone who was beaten in jail and then having that corroborated by one of the newspapers. There were ways in which I felt like I could really land on a version of what happened. But again, I was really careful in my acknowledgments to point out this is a fictional account of these things, and to show some of my sources so that people can read more and hopefully come to that moment of history on their own. But I think no matter how you come at a moment of history like this, you can't help but admire the idealism and the activism of these young people who fought so hard for basic fairness and decency.
I mean, whatever your politics are, I think you can't read a novel like this and get to know these characters and come away completely discounting the free speech riots of that earlier era and the labor movement. If you just look around at our world today and look back at the story of someone like Rai, who, although he's a fictitious character, is so realistically drawn and is pinned to these real life events and real people. So I'm thinking about how, social justice is a term that people talk about, or they shy away from, or they don't want to talk about it. They're afraid to talk about it, or they're not, but when living through moments like these in the early 1900s, and then now in 2020, it makes me feel that the present moment is so, excuse the pun, but it's so pregnant with possibility that we could somehow come to see the impact of modern day Elizabeth Gurley Flynn's come to fruition in the not so distant future in ways that, move beyond what we've seen so far with, for example, just the removal of statues or the changing of names of buildings, right? I don't know. So I've been thinking a lot about that lately. That those connections, and exactly as you say, you can look at a work like this and see the impact that these young people had.
It's funny. I've gotten the question before. This is such an interesting period. Were you tempted to write nonfiction? And I was. The thing that you were able to create with historical fiction, with any fiction, is a real sense of empathy, because you can create a full three-dimensional character like Rai Dolan, and there's something that happens when you see him learn to tie a tie for the first time, that you connect with yourself. You connect so completely with that person. Now, this is a period of time in which immigrants were demonized in the way they have been the last 4 years. And this is the moment in history when America first enters the lexicon as a political cudgel. And so when those immigrants are, brown-skinned people that, from countries that some Americans look down upon, perhaps reading a novel about when immigrants from Serb and Slav countries, when Irish immigrants were looked down upon, when there were signs saying, no Irish allowed, perhaps it causes, in that moment of empathy, people to look at immigration differently, to look at those requests differently. This last summer, the protests were not theoretical. They were not thought experiments. They were about life and death, about what it's like to be an African American and to have to give your son a speech about what happens, if he's beaten by law enforcement. And I think it's, as a novelist, it's unfortunate that empathy becomes politics, that we don't start with empathy for other human beings and their experiences. But it's one of the great things about reading all fiction, is that it anyone who does that engages in being in someone else's point of view long enough, that I think it's one of the ways in which we can change and shape their very sense of what's behind some of these issues. And even if it doesn't change what you believe, you at least allow yourself to see the world behind those people for whom those issues are important.
Jess Walter, thank you so much for talking to me today.
Thank you. Thanks for that great read of the book.
Jess Walter is the author of The Cold Millions. This has been Book Public from Texas Public Radio. Write to us at bookpublic@tpr.org. Jacob Rosati composed our theme music. Bree Kirkham is our digital producer. Dan Katz is Texas Public Radio's news director. I'm Yvette Benavides.